We continue now at the top of Daf Chaf Hey Amid Beis Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 25b. This daf is sponsored by Sheldon Hamburger in memory of Joel Hamburger, Yosef ben Yisrael. Thank you for your sponsorship. If you would like to sponsor an Amid or Daf, see the description box below, and see the description box below to see how you can support this channel. The Gemara now continues a statement from Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba. The person who's shechting the carbon, he has to make sure that the viridin are l'socha kli, that the viridin, which are the veins that have the blood, those should be inside the vessel that's receiving the blood. And the Gemara continues, Itmar Nami was stated as well. Amar Ravasi, Amar Rav Yochanan. Ravasi says that Rav Yochanan says, viridin, when it comes to the veins, tzarich sheyiru avir kli, they need to see the airspace of the vessel that's receiving the blood. And Rashi explains, viridin l'socha kli, again, the veins, he has to make sure they're in the vessel, meaning to say, denahave kabola meha por shapir, that it's going to properly be receiving directly from the bull. V'hai toch lav dafka, Rashi notes, it doesn't literally mean that the veins need to be inside the vessel. Tahalo efsher, that's not really possible. Ella al aviro shel toch kli, it just means that it has to be over the airspace of the inside of the vessel, again, so that it should be able to go directly to the vessel. And the Gemara continues, Boy minei Rabbi Yasi mi Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yasi asks Rabbi Yochanan the following question: Haya makabel v'nivchasu shulei mizrak. Let's say he's being makabel, he's receiving the blood, but the bottom of the bowl, it actually deteriorates, it breaks. Ad shelo higia dam la'aver, before the blood actually reaches the airspace. So mahu, what would be the halacha in such a situation? The point over here is that the blood is now going to go into the vessel, but it's not going to stay in the vessel. It's going to drip down to the floor. So what's the halacha? Avir she'ein sof, if you have airspace where it's not going to come to rest, kimunach dami, is that considered like it's already coming to rest? Meaning, it's considered that it really entered the vessel and then spilled on the floor, which would still be kosher. Olo kimunach dami, or maybe it's not like it came to rest, meaning it's as if it spilled on the floor first. If you then collect the blood and put it back into the vessel, so then that's going to be problematic because it didn't enter the vessel first. That is the question. And Rashi explains, shulei mizra karkiyaso means again the bottom of the bowl. Mizrak, before the blood reaches the airspace of the mizrak, meaning levein dofnei mizrak, before it reaches the walls, between the walls of the bowl, ba'od hadam lamala mehen, the blood is still above. Umiu al keneged avirohe, now nevertheless, they're still above that airspace. It's within the airspace, so to speak, of the bowl. It's just not within the airspace of the bowl. To havridin roim aver kliba, because we already said that the veins need to be able to see the airspace of the vessel. So essentially, the blood is above, but directly above the vessel, but hasn't yet even arrived at the airspace of the vessel, and then the bottom of the vessel, it breaks. So what's the halacha in such a situation? Avir shein sofa lenuach. This is airspace, but it's not going to come to rest. Kagon haisha asidim shulav lipol. Over here, the bottom is going to fall out. Ad shelo yanuach dam lesocho, before the blood ever gets there. Kamunach dami. So maybe that should be like it's at rest. Meaning v'havalei kamisha niskabel. It's like it was received v'nishbach and then poured out. The kosher laosvo. It's then kosher. You can regather it. Maybe it's not like it came to rest. Maybe it's as if it directly fell from the neck, it spilled from the neck to the floor, deposit, which is disqualified. Now Rashi notes, let's say the blood actually reaches the airspace of the walls of the vessel before the bottom breaks. Lo mi boile, that actually is not a question. Because they're already at that moment that it's in there, so it's in there and the vessel is not yet broken, that would be considered a Kabbalah. The question is if it breaks beforehand, before the blood ever reaches that airspace of the vessel itself. That is the question of the Gemara. And the Gemara continues, Amar Le, he said to him, Tani Sua, we learned the answer to the question from the following Brisa. This Brisa is talking about the Mechatas. The Mechatas are the waters of purification. They are used to purify someone who's Tamei Meis. And so the Brisa says, Chavis Shemunachas Tachas Hazinok. Let's say you have a barrel that's placed underneath a pipe of running water. Mayim Shebesocha Vishabechutza Lapsul. And the water that's within it and the water that's outside of it is disqualified as Mechatas. Tziref Pia Lezinok. Now let's say you attach the mouth of the barrel to the pipe, so then mayim shebesocha, the water within it, psulin, that's disqualified. V'shebechutza laksher, but the water outside of it, that is kosher. And Rashi explains, chavis shemunach tachas hazinok. There's a barrel underneath the pipe. It means tzinor hamekaleach mayim maher. You have a pipe, it has flowing water, the water is running quickly. Zakuf, and that's upright. V'hakiluach mekaleach lemeirachok, and then there's a stream that goes to some distance. V'nofel lechavis, and it falls into a barrel. barrel. That's how the water goes from the pipe some distance to the barrel. And the point over here is the barrel was not placed there for the purpose of the sanctification of the mechatas. That's why the barrel is problematic. So then mayim shebesocha v'shebechutza lapsul, and all water is disqualified, whether it's within, whether it's outside of the barrel. Kilomar means to say shelo yitein kli l'soch avira, means to say he can't take a vessel and place it in that airspace v'yochzenu biyado, holding it in his hand l'kabel bo hakiluch l'kiddush, in order to receive the stream of water for the purpose of sanctification. V'af lo chutza lo lamala me'ogneha keneged avira, he can't do it outside of it as well. In other words, he can't place it within the airspace of the barrel to catch the water, and you can't do it outside of the airspace. Why? Once the water reaches the area corresponding to the airspace of the barrel, it's really as if the water already came to rest within the barrel. It's no longer considered chiyusayu, it's no longer considered mayim chayim, which is the flowing water. The requirement by mechatas is the mayim chayim has to go directly to the kli for the purpose of sanctification. Over here it's as if it already came to rest in the barrel, which was not put there for the sake of sanctification, and that's why it's problematic. The point here is, Alma, we see, Avir kemunach dami. Even though it's in the airspace, it's as if it came to rest. Well, now the Gemara later will ask, Hi Avir shasofo lanuachu. This doesn't answer our question at all, because this is a case of airspace where it will come to rest. The whole question of the Gemara by the mizrak, by the bowl that was receiving the blood, is by Avir she'ein sofo lanuach. Again, the bottom of the bowl broke, and therefore it was ein sofo lanuach. There's a question whether it's kemunach dami or not. Here it's simply saying that if it's Avir shasofo lanuach, that it's kemunach dami. And the Brisa continued and said, Siref piyal azinok, let's say there is no airspace. The mouth of the barrel is right by the pipe. She'ein avir mafsik bein piyal azinok, there is no airspace separating between the mouth of the barrel and the pipe with the water. So then shebesocha, the water within it. Kilomar, shebo lesoch avir dof noseh, now the water is within the airspace of the walls of the barrel. Psulam, that's disqualified. But shebechutzala, but if it's outside of it, afal pi shekeneged avira, even though it corresponds to the airspace, kesher, and it's kosher. Shadayin lo pirshu min hatzinor. The point is, in such a situation, it hasn't yet left the tzinor, it hasn't yet left the pipe. Ve'afilu avir ein kan. That's not even called avir yet. That's why it's not problematic in that situation. In any case, the Gemara here seems to be bringing a brisa, which is proving that avir shasofo lanuach is considered kemunach dami. And so that's why the Gemara asks that this doesn't answer our question at all. Hi mai, what kind of comparison is this? Boy minei avir she'ein sofo lanuach. The question was by avir she'ein sofo lanuach. Then he gives him an answer about Avir Shasofo Lanuach. And the Gemara continues and answers, Tarti kaboy mine. Actually, when he asked the question, he was asking a two-part question. Im tim zolomar Avir she'ein sofo lanuach. If you're going to answer me that Avir she'ein sofo lanuach, if it's airspace where it's not going to come to rest, if you're going to say lav kemunach dami, that's not considered at rest. So then there was a second question, Avir shasofo lanuach mai. What would be true, or what would be the halacha by Avir shasofo lanuach? And to that part of the question, we're bringing the brisa to answer that. And the Gemara continues, Rav Yosef Masni Hachi, Rav Yosef, he learns the above exchange as we just learned it above. Rav Kahana Masni, but Rav Kahana taught it as follows, slightly different. He taught it as follows. Chavis boy mine, that the original question actually was with regards to the case of the barrel, meaning the case of the mechatos. The question was, what's the halacha in that situation where it's going from the pipe through the air into the chavis? Is that considered a situation where, again, if it's over the airspace of the chavis, it's considered to be at rest already, and it's not going to be good for mechatos? Upashat le chavis, and then he answered him from the brisa, which discusses chavis, so he gave him a direct answer from the brisa. That's how Rav Kahana learned, and it had nothing to do with our case of the Kabbalah of the receiving of the blood with the bowl. Rabba Masni Chavis. Rabba actually learned the sugi as follows. He said, Chavis boy mine. He said the question was with regards to a barrel, meaning with regards to the mechatos. Upashat le mizrak. And he actually brought him an answer from mizrak, from the case of a bowl, just a simple case of receiving the blood of lay carbon, the blood after you slaughter the animal in the mizrak, in the bowl, because he said the following: don't you admit, when it comes to a mizrak, it's impossible below zinok, meaning it has to be that there is some kind of airspace that it's going through into the bowl, and yet that is considered to be effective. And again, we said on the previous summit that the blood has to go directly from the neck of the animal into the bowl. It can't be anything in between, so it must be that the airspace is considered to already be in the bowl, otherwise there would be something in between, and therefore you see from that kamunach dami, that it is considered as if it already came to rest. And Rashi explains, Chavis boy minei, he asked him the question by the barrel itself. This was again the version where the question was about mechatos, and the answer was from the brisa of mechatos, meaning lo have shemia le hamas nisin. He didn't hear this brisa that we brought about mechatos. Uvoy minei chavis shemunachas tachas azinok mayim shebechutzala keneged avira mahu liklot osan lemechatos. He wanted to know again exactly this case when you have a situation of a barrel that's placed underneath the pipe. So again, that water, is it going to be good for mechatos or not? Upashalem hamas nisin. And then the answer from the brisa that in fact it is disqualified. And then the other version, the third version, is upashad le mizrach. He gave the answer to chavis from the case of the mizrach, the bowl. Tseyu lamad mi kabbalas dam, meaning you can learn from a general case of kabbalas dam. When it comes to the bowl, it's impossible otherwise. Meaning k'sheshochet al avir hakli ein adam shoses b'mekomo el mekaleach l'rochav hakli ad lahalan. When a person is going to be shochet, he's slaughtering over the airspace of the vessel, so the blood is not b'makomo, it's going to create a stream to the vessel. If the airspace which is going to come to rest is not like it's at rest, then it's coming to the vessel from the air. It's not coming directly from the bull. And the Torah says, it has to be directly from the bull. And therefore by the chavis also, it's considered kamunach, and it is disqualified. And the Gemara continues, Tanan Hasam, we learned in a Mishnah over there, this is a Mishnah in Meseches Pora, Nosan yodo o raglo o ala yerakos, if he places his hand or his foot, or he places the leaves of vegetables, kidei sheyavru mayim lechavis, in order that the water should pass to the barrel. This also is talking about the mechatos, the waters of purification. So if it passes through any of those items, so then psulin, then the waters are disqualified. But ale konim, but if it's leaves of reeds, ve'ale agozim, if it's leaves of nuts, kesheira, so then the waters are kosher to use as mechatos. And the Mishnah says, Zahaklal, this is the rule, davar hamekabel tumah, if it's passing through something that's able to receive tumah, that's able to become tameh, so psulin, so then the waters are disqualified. But davar sheino mekabel tumah, if it passes through something that's not mekabel tumah, so ksherin, then the waters are kosher. And the Gemara says, Minohani Mili, from where do we know this? The Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Yossi bar Abba, because Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Rabbi Yossi bar Abba, Amar Krotz, because the pasuk says, Ach mayon uvor mikveh mayim yiyeh tahor. It talks about the fact that the mikveh mayim is pure, and we understand the pasuk to mean havayosin, that the way you're going to get those waters, al yedei taharate, it has to be through purity, and that's why it can't be through something that is mekabel tumah. And Rashi explains, Nasan yodo o raglo kiluach hayored mehar mu'ukum. Let's say you have a stream of water, it's coming down a mountain, it's going through a crooked path. Shemeshapeya va'ola, again, it's going down, and it's winding down. Ve'en hakiluach yored l'chavis, and that stream of water is not able to get directly into the barrel. Ve'nasan yodo l'mala merosh hatzinor lasos kein marzev, so he places his hand above to make almost like a gutter, like a pipe, so to speak. Kedei sheyavru hamayim derech yodo. He's doing that in order that the water can go through his hand, l'chavis shel kiddush, to the barrel, which is going to be used for sanctification for the mechatos. V'chein ala yerakos, he uses leaves of yerakos, of vegetables, haruyin lachila. The point is these are able to be eaten. Something that's able to be eaten, that's edible, makabel tumah, it's makabel tumah, and anything that's makabel tumah, as we said, psul and hamayim, then the waters are disqualified, k'di yolef l'kamei, like we learn it later on. And the Gemara then said, we learn it from the pasuk again, havayosan shel mayim hamitarim, the creation of these waters which are purifying, al yedei taharate, it has to be made through purity. Kisha'ata mahava osam lios mikvah, if you're turning them into, let's say, a mikvah, o kiddush, or you're using them for sanctification, have mahava osam al yedei davar shein mekabel tumah, you have to create, so to speak, those waters through something that is not mekabel tumah. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rabbi Chia, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Chia says that Rabbi Yochanan says, Zoso meres, this shows, Avir kli kechli dami, that the airspace of a vessel is like the vessel itself. Rashi explains, Zoso meres avir kli kechli dami, midakatani nosan yado pasal, from the fact that it says if he uses his hand, he places his hand there, that's a disqualification. That shows that the airspace of the vessel is like the vessel. Ta'ina mayim shows us in miyado lechli b'shesisa ela b'havara, because Rashi explains the water is not dripping directly into the vessel, that would be called shesisa, rather it's passing through the air before it gets to the vessel. Kesheyotzin miyado mekalchelim al pnei rochav piachavis v'afilu hachi pasal, nevertheless, even though it goes through that airspace, still it's disqualified. Alma mishayatsu miyadu lekaleach al pnei aver. You see that when it leaves his hand and it creates that stream in the airspace, havale keilu shasasu miyadu lekli. It's the equivalent of going directly to the vessel. Shareyado al keneged svas hakli munachas, because his hand is by the edge of the vessel. Umishayatsu miyadu mekalchim bo keneged aviro. Now they're in the airspace of the vessel when they leave his hand. The ilav kechli dami, and the point over here is as follows: if it's not like a vessel, if the airspace is considered not like it's in the vessel, amai apostle, so why would his hand create a disqualification? Halomin ha'avir boin lo, it's coming really from the airspace into the vessel, not directly from his hand. That would be the equivalent of, let's say he places his hand in the pipe 10 amos away from where the stream is, so that also obviously would not be a disqualification just because his hand touches the water when it's up within that gutter, within that pipe. That would not make any difference. And so therefore it must be that when it goes from his hand into the airspace of the vessel, it already is in the vessel. It's considered to be directly from his hand, and that's why there is that disqualification. But the Gemara continues, Amar le Rabbi Zeira le Rabbi Chia bar Abba. Rabbi Zeira said to Rabbi Chia bar Abba, V'dilma b'sho says, how do you know you have a proof from here that the airspace of the vessel is like the vessel? Maybe it's just a weak flow, and it just essentially drips directly into the vessel. Maybe it's not going through the air. Amar le said to him, Tarda imbecile, Kedei sheyavru mayim l'chavis tanan. The Mishnah formulates it that it's that the water should pass to the barrel, and therefore that indicates that it is not a weak flow. Rashi explains, Dilma b'shoses miyado l'kli, maybe it just drips from his hand right to the vessel. V'lo bo mino aver, it's not coming from the airspace. So he said to him, Tarda shota bol, he said, you imbecile, sheyavru tanan. It says the word sheyavru. V'havara b'kiluach mashma. The word havara, it sounds like kiluach, it sounds like it is creating a stream of water through the air, and so therefore, again, it is a proof that aver kli is kechli dami. And the Gemara continues, V'yamar Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, and Rabbi Chia bar Abba said that Rabbi Yochanan said, Me'edusa shel Rabbi Tzadok, from the testimony of Rabbi Tzadok, Nishnis Mishnah Zu, this Mishnah was taught, meaning the Mishnah above in Meseches Para, it comes from the testimony of Rabbi Tzadok that we see in the following Mishnah. This Mishnah is in Meseches Edios Tetanan, as we learned in the Mishnah Meseches Edios, Heyid, Rabbi Tzadok testified, Al hazochlin shekilchon ba'olei, it goes in again, if you have the leaves of nuts and you use those to create a pipe to divert the water, shehein ksherin, that is kosher, because again, that's not mekabel tumah, as we said above. Zehaya maisa bohalia, this was an incident in Ohalio of a maisa lefnei chachamim, and the incident came before the chachamim, belishkas hagazis, and the lishkas hagazis, which is where the Sanhedrin was, v'echshiro, and they said that it was kosher. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rabbi Zeira, Amar Rabbi Zeira said that Rabbi said, and the Bachir changes the girsa to Amar Rabbi Zeira, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, that Rabbi Zeira said, that Rabbi Yochanan said, Hatsorem ozen hapar, let's say a person, he nicks the ear of the bull, meaning he creates this blemish. This is after the shchita, after the slaughtering of the carbon, he creates a blemish, v'acharkach kibel damo, and then he does the kabbalah sadam, he receives the blood of the animal, pasal, that's a disqualification. Shenemar, as it says in the pasuk, v'lokach midam hapar, it says that he takes from the blood of the par, it means par shahoya kevar, it means the bull that was already before, just like it didn't have a blemish before, it cannot have a blemish after the shchita as well. The Gemara says, Eshkechon kachei kachim. Now we find this pasuk by the par is talking about kachei kachim. Again, kachei kachim refers to karbanos, like a carbanola, for example. But kachim kalim and olin, but from where do we know that it applies to kachim kalim? Kachim kalim would be something like a carbon shlomim. And the Gemara says to that, Amar Rava says, Tanya, we learned in a brisa, said Tamim Zachar ben Shana. It says in the pasuk, Tamim Zachar ben Shana. Tamim refers to no blemishes, and Zachar ben Shana, it's male and it's a year old, and that means Sheyeh Tamim uven Shana. It has to be with no blemish, and it has to be a year old, b'shas shchita, at the time of the slaughtering, b'kabola, b'holocha, b'zrika minayin. Now, how do we know that's also true? By the receiving of the blood, by the conveying of the blood, and by the throwing of the blood. Talmud lomar yiyah, it says yiyah, kol havayason, everything, kol havayosov, everything you're doing with the carbon, lo yu el atam uven shana, it has to be a tam, it has to be with no blemishes, and it has to be ben shana, it has to be a year old. Eisvei Abaye asks on this from the following brisa. Rabbi Yoshua says, Kol azvochim shebetorah, all the karbonos in the Torah, shenishtayir man kazayis basar, even if all that remains of the animal is a kazayis of meat, or kazayis chaylev, or kazayis of chaylev, zorek as adam, you're still able to do the zrik as adam, and so that seems to go against what we just quoted over here. We said that by the zrika, it needs to, even at that point in time, it needs to be a whole animal. And the Gemara says, you're right, in that regard, tirgama aben shana, rather, when the Brisa was saying that by the other avodos it needs to be the same as by shchita, that means to say it needs to be a year old. That was not a reference to the fact that it needs to be unblemished. And the Gemara continues, Umika midi de v'shas shchita ben shana b'shas holachu zrika ben shtayim. Is it possible that an animal is a year old at the time of the slaughtering, and then it's 2 years old at the time of the conveying or the throwing of the blood? Amar Rava said, Zos omeris shows postlos bekachim. This shows that hours create disqualifications by kachim, meaning we go by the exact moment of birth. So it is in fact possible that it's 1 year old at the time of the shchita, but it's 2 years old at the time of the holacha or the zrika. And Rashi explains, Hatsorem dehave mum, we're talking about a blemish of the ear, detnan and nifkema ozno gabe mum. We have that example in Bechoros, that's considered a blemish. V'yacharkach ki beldamo, then he receives the blood, meaning, dehave be mum bein shchita lekabala. The case over here is there's a blemish between the slaughtering and the receiving of the blood. Shahaya kvar, meaning tzarech shi'e sholem, b'shas kabala ki b'shas shchita. It has to be a whole animal at the time of the receiving of the blood, just like the slaughtering. The Gemara then said, Eshkechon katshe kachim, we find that by katshe kachim. The Haiba Par Ksiv, it's written by the case of the par, by the bull, which is Katshe Kachim. How do we know by Kachim Kalim? The Gemara then brought the pasuk of Ben Shana, has to be a year old. That's a pasuk by Karban Pesach, which is an example of Kachim Kalim. And then the Gemara said, B'shas Shchita, the Ksiv Tachosu ala said, Hainu Shchita, V'samach le said Tamim. It says Tamim and Ben Shana by Shchita. How do we know by the other avodos? But then the Gemara asked, didn't we also say, Shenishtayer mehen B'shas Zrika? Let's say at the time of the Zrika Saddam, all that's left. Let's say everything becomes tamei. O sha'avar gets lost. Lo yizrok. So it says in such a situation you don't do the zrika. Rabbi Yoshua l'taimei dedarish v'yasiso losecha basar v'adam. I mean basar ein dam. If you don't have meat, he learns from the pasuk you don't have blood. B'menachas katani mia zorek. So it says zorek. Vein lach bal mum gadol mizeh. That's certainly a blemish, a great blemish. So kasha l'Rava. Now that's difficult to Rava. Diyamar bo'inan tam b'shaz rika, because Rava says that it needs to be a tam. It needs to be without blemish at the time of Zrika. Here it says all that you need, all that needs to be remaining is just a kazayis, and so therefore that's a question on Rava. Now Rashi notes, Avol Rabbi Zera lo kasha. Now this is not a question on Rabbi Zera, the holo boy tam ela b'shchita v'kabola, because Rabbi Zera only said that it needs to be a tam by the shchita and the kabola. So this is not a question on Rabbi Zera, but on Rava this is difficult, because Rava seemed to say that it even needs to be a tam b'shas Zrika, and here we're saying that is not the case. And the Gemara then said, Tirgama ben Shana, all the Brisa means is ben Shana. Abai Amar le Rava, Abai is saying to Rava, Tirgama ben Shana lemasnizach, the boy call Havayosov, B'shas Shchita ben Shana koi. When the Brisa says that everything needs to be the same as at the time of the Shchita, that means to say it needs to be a year old. The Salik Mineh, that's what the Brisa was talking about over there. Ben Shana yiyah, kol Havayosu yeh ben Shana, everything has to be when it's a year old. Avalim nichnas b'shana shniya ben Shchita l'zrika, if it becomes 2 years old between the Shchita and the Zrika, Apostle is disqualified. This shows postlos bekachim, because hours can create disqualification by kachim. Kedeperish vazal, as the Gemara will go on to explain. Avol tam lo teilif mine, but you can't learn the idea that it has to be a tam from there. The hayiyah lav atamim kai, it's not going on the tamim over there. The word yiyah. The kabola bekachim kalim bitmim. What's now in terms of the fact that receiving of the blood by kachim kalim, that has to be without blemish. So that will simply say hoel v'goli bekachim kachim goli. Once that's the halacha by kachim kachim, so that's true true by Kachim Kalim as well. And then the Gemara said, shows postlos bekachim, hours can disqualify by kachim. The shonu hamura bekachim kaimel and perak yotzei dovin Meseches nida. The ein monin la mitishrei kashar Rosh Hashanah. You don't count the age of the animal from Rosh Hashanah. Ela miyom shenolad. Rather, you count from the day it's born. May ace lace, and it goes from hour to hour, the exact time l'shana haba to the next year. V'alfinan la mikra dechsibu ben shenaso shalo. We learn it from the pasuk. V'lo shenaso shal minyan olam. We don't go by the years of the calendar date of the world. We don't go by Tishrei, by Rosh Hashanah, rather we go by when it's born. Now don't say that it goes by the day and not the hour. It goes even by the hour. If it was born in Nisan on the 14th at 9 hours, and the Shechit is at that point in time, but you're not going to be able to do this Rikas Adam in the 10th hour, Shekvar of Rosh Hashanah, because now the year has already passed. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rabbi Yami, Amar Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Yami says that Rabbi Elazar says, He bifnim, let's say the animal is inside, v'ragleh b'chutz, but the legs of the animal are outside of the Azara. Chotach v'yachar gach shachar, if he cuts off those legs and then does the shchita, kesheira, so then it is going to be kosher. And Rashi explains, Hu bifnim be'azara, the animal's in the Azara. Chotach ragleh, he cuts off the animal's legs. V'yachar gach shachar, and then he slaughters the animal, kesheira, it's kosher. Shalom nesarev dam psul yotzei, im dam shebemizrak. So now the blood, which was outside of the Azara, is not mixed up with the blood that's in the bowl, sheneskabel bo hadam, which receives the blood. Ulakamei parach, and Rashi notes that later the Gemara will ask, Hashavya balas mum, isn't there a problem over here that the animal is now a balas mum and now has a blemish? So you have that problem in this situation. So how could it be that this is effective? And we'll read the next Rashi as well. This is on the next Amud. Shachar v'yachar chotach psula, if he slaughters and then he cuts it, so then it's disqualified. Shemisha nishchata nifsal dam haraglayim biyotze, because in that case, if he slaughters and then cuts off the legs, when it's slaughtered, so then the blood that's in the legs is yotze, that's outside of the Azara. V'chol dmei behema yonkim zeh mizeh, and all of the blood of the animal is all connected to one another. V'olav v'yotze derech beis hashchita, it's all coming out through the area where it was slaughtered. V'nisarev b'dam hamizrak, it's going to be mixed up in the blood of the bowl upaslo, and it will be disqualified. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Chavav Amud Aleph.